Today I'm going to talk to you about coral reefs and money. Often that causes a bit of a stir, and it's a unique subject, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and why I'm motivated to do the work that I do. I started my academic career as a chemist. Maybe most of you don't know that. Where I gained an understanding and healthy respect for the concept of a rate-limiting step, a component of a reaction that determines how fast something moves forward. And I'm going to return to that concept a couple times. I then did a master's degree, and I pulled these out last night. These are slides from my master's thesis defense. A really long time ago, it made me feel really old when I worked on nutrient uptake of experimental coral and algal communities. So I had a foundation in the natural sciences. But after my master's degree, I started working in coral reef management, and I came to the conclusion that the natural sciences were completely necessary, but not sufficient to save coral reefs. I then began working for several years on stakeholder engagement and the community and social and cultural sides of coral reefs. I had a lot of fun working in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands. I got to know communities such as this one, Milili'i, also known as the last fishing village of Hawaii, where these kids and their families are dependent on fisheries resources for their food, their livelihood, and continuing of the Hawaiian culture. Through lots of people's hard work and many, many years of working on it, I facilitated the development of the Hawaii Fish Trust. And this program was to support communities like Milili'i in managing their resources. And the day that this program was funded was really bittersweet for me. On the one hand, we had $10 million to support communities in co-management of their resources. So I was ecstatic for these kids and their families. On the other hand, I knew from firsthand experience how many people, how many years, how much lost sleep there was to get this program funded. It was hard work. And I could see ahead of me this future of a treadmill of always looking for more money. So then I came to the conclusion that working with bringing stakeholders together was necessary, but not sufficient. And I went back to first principles and asked myself, what is that rate limiting step? And to me, I think it's finance. So here I am, 3.5 years later, to tell you about the results of my research. I'll give you a general introduction to the field, followed by presenting 4 research papers, and then some general discussion and conclusions. Global natural capital sustains human well-being. We rely on nature to give us ecosystem services such as clean air and food. But society is depleting and damaging this natural capital to the point that it's undermining the Earth's ability to sustain human populations. The economic cost of this damage far outweighs investment into conservation, leading to a large and growing conservation funding gap. I've estimated globally that this gap is on the order of $7 trillion every year and growing. While there's a lot of ongoing research to solve these issues, including sustainable development, environmental management, environmental finance, to name a few, a lot of the work, particularly in environmental finance, is in the terrestrial environments. But because of big differences in marine and terrestrial environments, both in terms of the ecology and management principles, we need to look at conservation finance for the marine realm in particular. And there's not been a lot done on this. A lot of the work in marine conservation finance today has been done by nonprofits, and there's some really good foundations to build upon. But there's not been done in an academically rigorous way in the peer-reviewed literature. At the same time, marine conservation literatures abound in factors that constrain the success of marine conservation. For example, effective governance, good enforcement, and so on. But there's an overarching limit that has not been adequately addressed in the literature or in practice, and that's finance. The aim of my research was to investigate strategies and financial mechanisms to decrease impacts to marine resources and increase effective investment into marine resource management. My work is very interdisciplinary. across from economics and finance through to coral reef ecology and conservation planning. And by the nature of the topic, it's also very cross-sector. I work closely with government, industry, nonprofits, and so on. I've developed a global-scale framework and then zoomed in to several local case studies to look at the detail. We use critical policy analysis, semi-structured interviews, and surveys to do this work. So to give you an overview of the work, Chapter 2 is the foundation for the need for and scope of the emerging field of marine conservation finance. Before I jump into the details of what this foundation looks like, there's one figure from this publication which is sort of a coat hanger for the rest of the chapter. So I'm going to pull that forward and present that next. This is a conceptual diagram that illustrates how the intent of a business correlates to the conservation funding gap on the x-axis and net environmental outcomes on the y. If you look at the left end of this conceptual spectrum, this represents profit-maximizing businesses. These are businesses that damage the environment and lead to large conservation funding gaps and net negative environmental outcomes. Moving towards the center, we find triple bottom line businesses, where triple refers to economic, ecological, and social. These businesses voluntarily mitigate their environmental impacts and get some resultant private profits. As we move up the spectrum, in the far right end are social enterprises. These are businesses created with the intent to produce net positive environmental outcomes. Instead of contributing to the conservation funding gap, they use business models to produce societal outcomes. One of the key findings from Chapter 2 is that to decrease the marine conservation funding gap, we need to engage all types of businesses, no matter where they lie on the spectrum. But that the tool of engagement depends on the intent of the business. In Chapter 3, I am investigating one example tool, the use of offsets in the Great Barrier Reef. Chapter 4 looks at the example of using a loan fund in the Great Barrier Reef for agriculture. And Chapter 5 is a global survey. Because there are so few examples of businesses operating up in this realm, I had to do it globally instead of a local example. I'm now going to give you the details of each chapter in turn. The aims of Chapter 2 were to review the state of marine conservation finance, investigate the challenges associated with funding marine conservation, understand the potential consequences of the marine conservation funding gap, and propose recommendations to address those problems. Through a synthesis of the literatures, crossing from grey to peer-reviewed and crossing several disciplines, we identified 5 challenges related to marine conservation finance and 5 recommendations. And I'm going to go through each one of these in turn. First, funding for marine conservation is inadequate in 3 ways: the size, diversity, duration, and diversity of funding revenue. While we do not have an estimate yet of the portion of this gap that is relevant to the marine environment, we do have evidence that marine conservation is chronically underfunded around the world. But it's not just about the amount of money. It's also about the duration. Most funding for marine conservation comes in allotments of 1 to 3 years. If you're really lucky, maybe 5 years. But the time frame to achieve and sustain marine outcomes and community benefits can be on the order of decades. So there's a temporal mismatch. Another issue is diversity. Most marine conservation is funded by grants. Most programs are reliant on 1 to 2 sources for their grants. This is risky, because if one of those sources falls away, the whole initiative can fall down, and I've seen that happen firsthand. The recommendation is very simple. Every marine conservation initiative needs a business plan. While that sounds simple, it's not happening. I did a survey in 2012 of 135 marine conservation practitioners representing 19 countries. Only 49% had any form of a business plan. Over half did not know how they were going to fund their important work. And that needs to change. The second challenge has to do with finance mechanisms, which are herein defined as instruments through which money flows from investors to investees. There are several examples of finance mechanisms for the marine environment, but most of these are very limited in terms of geographic and temporal scales. We need a lot more research and development to understand how to scale and replicate these mechanisms. And perhaps more importantly, there are many finance mechanisms being used on land for terrestrial conservation, and we need to better understand if, how, and where they can be applied for marine outcomes. And in this paper, we provide some tools to assist with that analysis. Challenge 3. Finance is disconnected from conservation planning. I'm going to pause here for a little caveat and say that I love parallelograms. I actually don't, but a lot of my work is presented with conceptual diagrams, which are really hard for an audience to access in a short seminar. I understand this. So what I'm going to do is use these little blue boxes to draw your attention to what I'm speaking about, and note that there'll be a lot more information in these diagrams that I can't talk about in the seminar, but we can discuss after. This diagram talks about the typical current process for conservation planning. There are some analyses that happen. If you're really lucky, some cost-benefit analysis is part of that, with stakeholder engagement leading to a prioritization process and a conservation strategy. Normally, after the strategy is done, another person or people say, well, how much is it going to cost? And last, where are we going to get the money? There's several problems with this. One of which is that stakeholder engagement. Most finance mechanisms impact communities. They need to be consulted when you pick your finance mechanism. That's not always happening. And also it's a timing issue. That gap between when your strategy is done and when you have money to implement causes massive issues for stakeholder engagement. The recommendation, again, drawing your eyes to this part of the diagram, is that financial analysis be integrated into conservation planning, early, often, and with the engagement of stakeholders. It's an iterative, ongoing process, and the output is a conservation strategy that has an integrated finance strategy, so we don't end up with half the world not knowing how to fund their conservation plans. Challenge 4 has already been discussed earlier, but to review that environmental externalities of business contribute to the conservation funding gap, and that we need tools to engage businesses, and I'll be speaking about each of these in more detail. Challenge 5, has to do with capacity. There's strong capacity in each of these fields that's important for marine conservation finance to build upon. So while there's a lot of published information and a lot of resources available within each of these fields, there's very limited capacity with the lens and the perspective of marine conservation finance to draw information and resources together from amongst these fields to focus on how do we solve this funding gap issue. The recommendation is that we have more specialists to swim among the fish, to draw people together and pull out those bits and pieces of relevant information, to form collaborations, where research institutions are only one of the several sectors that need to be involved, and these arrows in between these sectors represent flows of money and collaborative roles, how we work together to solve this problem. It's about capacity. To conclude this chapter, I've presented 5 recommendations to improve the field of marine conservation finance. We need a focus on finance that has not yet been happening. It's really important to develop specialist capacity and interdisciplinary collaborations. Lastly, a word on terminology. A lot of the work in conservation finance is done by NGOs who often label it as sustainable funding, as I have done for many years. I hate this term now. I really hate it, and I hope to change that, because this has the connotation that there's some magical threshold of money, and once you get there, you're sustainable, and you never have to worry about it again. It doesn't happen that way. I've never heard of it happening that way. Sometimes terminology carries a lot of weight, and you tell an investor that you want sustainable funding, he's never going to fund your program again. Instead, I recommend financial planning, because that gives the connotation that it's ongoing. Moving on to chapter 3, and using this diagram to remind you, that this is one example of a tool to generate revenue from profit-maximizing businesses who are causing large net negative environmental outcomes. I chose the case study of offsets in the Great Barrier Reef. I don't need to tell those of you in the room, you already know, the biodiversity and cultural values of the Great Barrier Reef have led to it being designated as a World Heritage Area, but that the Great Barrier Reef is at a crossroads. And offsets tend to be at the center of this discussion. Under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, when a developer applies for a permit that will lead to damage of the GBR, they are required to offset their unavoidable residual impacts. Those offsets, in the last few years, have totaled approximately $185 million that have been required of proponents by governments in the Great Barrier Reef region. Now, in this paper, we do not go into the debate of whether or not offsets should be allowed. We steer clear of that. But this paper is about if the current trend towards using offsets continues, how do we minimize the risks and maximize the benefits? And my question was, are Great Barrier Reef offsets effective? And if not, how do we improve policy and implementation? Using critical analysis of policy and comparing to international best practice, using the Business and Biodiversity Offsets Program, I will jump straight to the punchline. Current approaches to GBR offsets are 1, not likely to produce net benefits. The net benefit is a net positive environmental outcome. 2, are likely to increase the risk of regulatory capture by government agencies. That means that government decisions may be influenced, or at least the public might perceive that the government decisions are going to be influenced by the flow of funds. 3, are likely to allow trivial payments in exchange for extensive environmental damage. While that $185 million figure sounds big, it's quite trivial compared to the cost of economic damage that's happening. However, there's some strong science, and 29 countries around the world use offsets, and we can learn from international best practice to improve offsets in the Great Barrier Reef. In this paper, we present 9 principles based on the international best practice, but adapted for the GBR context. In the interest of time, I'm going to present some, but not all of these principles, with the aid of another conceptual diagram. The first step here has to do with the mitigation hierarchy. Mitigation hierarchy is this concept that first you should avoid damage, next you should mitigate damage, and only last should you consider offsets. That's consistent with EPBC policy, but it's not happening. And some of our recommendations to fix that are that governments should have better policies in place for how to avoid and how to mitigate. We have offset policies, we need better avoidance and mitigation policies. And also, the proponents have the onus on them to disaggregate these steps and to articulate how have they avoided, how have they mitigated, and what are the unavoidable residual impacts. So first and foremost is making sure the mitigation hierarchy is at work. Next, we recommend using an offsetability risk assessment. Now, offsetability is this ugly word which means that some impacts to some values cannot be offset. No matter how good your offset is, it's just not going to work. And we need to assess the risk. This is not happening in the Great Barrier Reef, and we recommend that it does. And offsetability, this is a risk assessment, again, based on best practice, adapted to GBR, that looks at things like the condition and the vulnerability of values and determines the risk. Can we offset it or not? And this diagram shows that if the risk is high, the recommendation is for proponents to go back and avoid. And if they're low or medium, then they can move forward to offset design. There are several considerations when you get to the step of offset design, one of which is what's your goal. This term of net benefits gets thrown around quite a bit. This is a diagram produced by Rio Tinto that's used all over the place to conceptualize what's a net benefit or a net positive impact. But through critical analysis, we found some issues with this. The first is this red line represents the condition of a biodiversity value. And this diagram shows it being static through time. That's not the case. For most values, especially in the GBR, natural fluctuations and anthropogenic impacts mean that your counterfactual baseline, line C, looks more like this. If a project goes forward and there's an impact, then we are in a degraded state, D. The goal of an offset should be to get to A or B, where A is aspirational. So first of all, it's about defining where you're trying to get to and what the counterfactual looks like. Another component to consider is who is designing and implementing the offset. 14 countries, including Australia, allow third parties to design and implement offsets, but that's not being done in the GBR yet. There's several reasons to do this. One is it reduces your risk of financial capture because it removes the government one step further from the offset. And two, there are so few examples of successful offsets around the world that we can increase the likelihood of success if we rely on specialists. Another consideration is where offsets are done. Right now, offsets are typically done close to an impact site. Picture in your brain for a second Gladstone Harbour, a place with chronic impacts. If you try to do an offset in Gladstone Harbour, your chances of success are low to nil. Instead, we recommend use conservation planning to identify strategic sites with long-term protection to consolidate offset efforts. Places where there's some damage, therefore some ability to recover, but also a place that is not so far gone that it can't recover. Places that we can pool resources to more cost-effectively monitor and manage these offsets. If and when an offset's approved, it's important that there is this phase about evaluation and funds available to evaluate, and if necessary, if the offset's not working, to go back and adapt and course correct. To conclude this section, Great Barrier Reef offsets are currently not effective, but there's hope. We could implement these principles, and some of that work is underway. And offsets could be one tool to make companies pay for damage to the environment instead of that liability being put onto governments and communities. Moving to Chapter 4, this is a case study somewhere around here in the spectrum of companies that are voluntarily trying to mitigate their environmental damage and have some economic profitability as a result. I chose the case study of the Great Barrier Reef Loan Fund. I wanted to look at environmental loan funds, and I'll explain first what that is. An environmental loan fund is a revolving fund that uses low interest rate loans, and you know what that is. If you go shop for a mortgage, you want the lowest interest rate possible to save money, so that's an incentive. So they use these low interest rate loans to incentivize behavior changes that lead to environmental outcomes. These are used a lot of the times on land for things like energy efficiency or restoring degraded lands. But I wanted to know, could they be used in the marine environment? So I looked for a case study where there was an industry with a history of environmental stewardship and economic modeling to say that when they did better environmental stewardship, they had better profitability. And I selected the agricultural industries in Great Barrier Reef region. Agribusinesses in the GBR have been actively involved in environmental stewardship for decades, but they're still the largest source of water pollutants to the GBR. And despite significant recent government funding, there's still not enough money. We're falling short of the estimated $800 million needed every 5 years to achieve ecologically relevant water quality targets. Now, the government's used this ABCD framework to report on the relationship between practices on farms and their effect on water quality. And this ABCD framework is a really important tool for the basis of this loan fund, because you'll see that for classes A and B, aspirational and best management, there is an effect on private profitability. This gives us the opportunity to investigate, could we use loans instead of grants to incentivize a transition? So I wanted to investigate the desirability and the feasibility of a loan fund for this purpose. And here are my 4 research questions. 1, what are the incentives and challenges for participation in a loan fund? 2, who is the most trusted entity to manage a loan fund? 3, what are feasible methods for determining eligibility for agribusinesses to access a loan fund? And 4, what environmental metrics should be monitored and by whom? And I conducted semi-structured interviews with 78 representatives of investors, government, NRM, ag industry, and water quality scientists. And I'll present the results by research question. This Venn diagram summarizes the motivations in black and concerns in red of the respondents grouped by sector. If you focus here on the center of the Venn diagram, you'll see that respondents across sector agreed that they would be motivated to participate in a loan fund because of their environmental stewardship ethics and because of increased funding stability for sustainable agriculture. However, they also all agreed that measuring environmental outcomes of a loan fund would be tricky, to say the least. All of these other motivations and concerns have been used to develop a prototype model, which I'll present at the end of this section. This table summarizes results for questions 2 and 3, where the columns represent options for entities to manage the loan fund, and the rows represent options for eligibility. How do we determine who can access a loan? And you'll see through my analysis that many combinations of entities and eligibilities were not deemed to be feasible. However, in turquoise here, so they got the green and the blue together, in turquoise, there are 7 feasible options for what this might look like. And one of those quickly rose to the top. And that is to use the ABCD framework, where loans can be used to incentivize changes from code of practice to best practice. There's enough certainty in the economic modeling that respondents believed that there would be private profitability in this change, and there would be enough profitability there to pay back the loan. This also allows government funds to be more effectively invested, both in compliance management and in grants to lead to aspirational practices which have less certainty in private profitability in the short term. Question 4. This was the tricky one. There was consensus across sectors that measuring water quality improvements at the appropriate geographic and temporal scales is simply not feasible in the next few years. That's both due to technology and cost. But there were several recommendations from the interviewees that a combination of auditing on-farm practices and modeling predicted benefits could help us to understand whether loan funds did or did not contribute to water quality improvements. This is a conceptual model of a proposed loan fund where each of these boxes is a sector, and this one in blue is the loan entity, management entity. And you can see these arrows represent flows of money and collaborative roles. So this is a proposed model of what it could look like. Results indicate that cross-sector support for concessionary loans to incentivize agribusinesses to transition from code of practice to best practice can result in improved farm profitability, investor profits, and land management changes that are modeled to produce improvements in water quality. And we recommend to pilot a loan fund in small to medium enterprises in the sugar industry. Moving on to chapter 5. This is where it gets really fun. Up in this realm, up here at the top of social enterprises. Now, as I mentioned before, there are so few social enterprises operating in the marine space, we had to do a global look. And social enterprise is one type of a bigger category called impact investments. Apologize for the size of this, I'm going to read it though. The Global Impact Investing Network defines impact investing as investments made into companies, organizations, and funds with the intention to generate social and environmental impact alongside financial return. The first thing I did, by way of background, was to compile information about what is this impact investing industry. It's quite a big, new industry, and I couldn't find a lot of information pulled together. There was bits and pieces in the peer-reviewed and grey literature. So I pulled together sort of what is this industry and how does it function. And I'm going to use this as a background to tell you more about what this is. So impact investors, like banks or multilateral organizations, make investments to investees, which could be a nonprofit or a social enterprise, using mechanisms such as debt or equity, with the help of intermediaries. And the literature was quite clear that because this is a new industry, intermediaries are crucial. They play this role of matchmaking. They bring together the two sides. They source the deals. They do due diligence, which means analyzing risk-return profiles. And without intermediaries, very few impact investment deals happen. They create blended value, which is a combination of financial and social and or environmental impact, ultimately helping beneficiaries such as communities. I'm going to give this, again, in a concrete example of Peterborough prison in the United Kingdom, where the goal was to reduce recidivism. Recidivism is the rate at which prisoners, after they're released from prison, go back into prison. And it was noted that recidivism was costing the government a lot of money. So the idea was the intermediary, named Social Finance, created a social impact bond and convinced the Rockefeller Foundation, among other investors, to invest in a small NGO who could cost-effectively reduce recidivism. And they did. And the resultant government savings were used to pay back the investors, ultimately benefiting individuals and communities. So I really want to know, can we do this for marine outcomes? Can impact investing produce marine outcomes through profit-generating or cost-saving business models? For my methods, I did a global search for existing marine impact investments. Is it already happening? And then I surveyed impact investors, and I'll talk to you about that survey. And I did a critical analysis of the components of impact investing relative to the marine conservation context. I did find some examples. These examples do not all consider themselves to be impact investments, but they do meet my definition. And I'll give you a few little stories. So in Raja Ampat in Indonesia, there's a resort called Misul, where a couple wanted to protect sharks. They wanted to set up a shark NPA. But instead of using the traditional grant-based model, they used a business model. They do receive some grant subsidies, but they do meet the definition of an impact investment. Another category of existing marine impact investments emerged in fisheries finance. For those of you in the room that work in fisheries, you will be aware that for many fisheries that transition from unsustainable to sustainable fisheries can result in better profitability. But there's a huge transition cost to make that happen in most cases. Now, what these impact investments did, and these are all out of California, but there's also examples in Europe, was they used private money in loans and equity, no grants, to fund that transition. And the resulting profitability was used to pay back the investors. So there are some examples out there, but they're very limited. As for what does the industry as a whole look like for marine impact investments, I did a survey of 21 impact investors. Now, I spent many years trying to get the trust of and get data out of fishermen, and that is hard. And I guarantee you, from my perspective, getting the trust of and talking to investors about their money is harder. I did this snowball sampling. I went to investors that I knew and had a professional relationship with, and I said, who else can I talk to? Give me the phone numbers of your friends. I got to 21, and I think that's pretty damn good. These investors are spread around the world, and 3 of them indicated that they had, in the past, given an investment into a marine impact investment. 19 of the 21 said they were very keen to invest in marine outcomes. So that's called supply side, and there's good evidence there, also consistent with the literature, that says that there's enough capital out there for impact investments. However, the limitations. Most investors that I talked to said there's a limit of investable deals. Show me the money. Where can I put my money that's going to give me financial return and marine outcomes? There's also a limit of the capacity of investees. I'm going to dig into that a bit. So there are very few marine social enterprises out there. There's a couple, but very few. And there are many nonprofits that have the desire to become social enterprises. But the capacity of those nonprofits to do so does not appear to be there yet. It's really difficult to make that transition from a grant-based nonprofit to a social enterprise. And some of the limitations are things like cultural shift in the organization. It can be a really big wall. Board and staff capacities, hiring and firing board members, it's a lot of fun. New risk assessments and financial insurances can be very costly. And transition capital is always an issue. There's grant money available, impact capital there. Nobody wants to fund the transition. Intermediaries. Again, the literature said this was crucial. Are there intermediaries for marine impact investments? I found a handful. I can name them on one hand. This is a key limitation. There are so few people focused on this, so few organizations focused on this, it would be really hard to move this industry forward without focusing on building intermediation. Mechanisms. I did find some examples of mechanisms that can produce both profits and marine outcomes, but they're really limited in terms of geographic and temporal scale, and we need more research and development to know if they're scalable and replicable. I did come across this idea of a business model competition, which is being used effectively in other realms to bring together social entrepreneurs, investors, and perhaps marine conservation practitioners to tease out some investable deals ideas. This sounds like repeat. When it comes to blended value, it's the same thing as the loan fund. How are we going to measure it? How do we know if we are creating impact? Now, there's a system called IRIS, which many impact investments use, but from my analysis, I don't think it's relevant to marine outcomes. Instead, I think we should connect to the impact evaluation work that Bob Presti and others are working on, and so come to the 4 o'clock seminar on that. Thank you. What's the future of marine impact investments? The potential is strong, particularly in tourism and fisheries. I've recommended business plan competition, but, a big but, we need to work in capacity, particularly intermediation capacity, and this sort of illustrates what that is. We need to bridge that gap. It's a wide gap people can't jump across, so we need some focus there. To summarize all of the chapters so far, there's a large and growing marine conservation funding gap which needs to be addressed. We need to integrate financial planning into conservation planning, early, often, and with the engagement of stakeholders. There are many finance mechanisms available, and many more that need research and development. All types of businesses should be engaged to reduce the conservation funding gap, but the tool of engagement depends on the intent of the business. For profit maximizing businesses, I give the example of offsets. These could be used to help draw resources out of those that are damaging the environment. But to make them effective, they need to be more rigorous, strategic, transparent, and use third parties. For businesses with voluntary environmental stewardship and privatized profits, we should consider the use of debt as a tool. I think there's a lot of potential there. There is also potential to use marine impact investments. However, we need to work on the capacity. Which brings me to my cross-cutting thematic findings. And you've heard me say this word 100 times, so I'm not going to say it out loud. But it's true. In all of these chapters, in all of these examples, and with the global framework, capacity came up as a key limitation over and over. Also the need for transition capital. To get us from where we are now to where we're going, we need to identify funders who are willing to help us make that change. This theme emerged often as well, this idea of a risk of financial capture or mission drift. The thought is, if you follow the money, you're going to lose your mission. I believe that's a real risk. However, I also have seen examples of good risk management strategies, scaffolding that can be put in place to minimize that risk. Lastly, we need to squeeze that funding gap from both sides, balancing effort between preventing environmental damage and identify new funding resources to pay for restoration. Now, Aidan Byrne, the CEO of the Australian Research Council, recently spoke to the Centre of Excellence about moving away from traditional measures of research effectiveness towards new alternative measures of research effectiveness. So I thought I'd give it a go. For Chapter 2, that was intended to be a foundation for this new field of research and practice, and I believe that it's been well received. Chapter 3, offsets, is directly being used by governments to develop new policies in research funding. A colleague of mine at the Department of Environment refers to it as the BOSE principles, and I think she's just jamming it in that I've changed my surname. Don't do it, anyone. Chapter 4 on loan fund. It's not just a theoretical exercise. It's a basis for real collaboration between a couple of the big banks in Australia, industry, and researchers, and I hope that that can be piloted in the next few years. Chapter 5 on impact investments. It's been taken up by nonprofits, for example, Reef Check Australia, which is looking to develop a marine social enterprise to obtain marine and community outcomes without the use of grants. I've authored several other things during the course of my PhD, including 3 articles for the conversation, which is a fun way to get your research out there, which turned into some media coverage, for example, this story by the ABC Environment. Limitations. Certainly there's some limitations of my work. Number 1, geography and economy. You can only do so much in 3 years. The case studies were clearly focused on the GBR, that's where I'm at. But there's a need to take this back to other economies and subsistence areas. I did a lot of work in the Pacific Islands previously. I would love to do some more of this work there in the future. Another limitation was I could only pick a few finance mechanisms to look at in detail. More work needs to be done, particularly on marine payments for ecosystem services. Investors and enterprises. I told you about how hard it was to get investors to talk to you about their money. This was a limitation. Access and sharing of data is difficult when you're talking to investors. In terms of future research and practice, I've outlined some research that's an extension of my PhD. And all of these, with the exception of the last one, are partially underway and partially funded. Concluding thoughts. I think it's the right of every PhD student to wax a bit philosophical. So I'm going to borrow from an ancient Roman philosopher, Lucretius, who talked about how atoms, and by extension societies, could swerve off of a predicted path because of free will. So I'm going to borrow from Lucretius to say, coral reefs are not destined to fail, nor are they guaranteed to survive. We can swerve off the path we're on. I don't think it's too late. Borrowing from my chemistry background, I'm going to postulate that finance is the rate-limiting step for change. Strategic focus on marine conservation finance is necessary for marine and community outcomes. That's my thesis.